Hi, and welcome to the Neoprene Playmat. I'm your host, Matt Piak, and today we're laying it all out like we do every Thursday. Essentially, this is the opportunity for me to climb up on my soapbox and talk about something going on in the board game industry that either grinds my gears or excites me in some way, gets my passion all riled up, lights a fire beneath me. And today I wanted to talk about intellectual properties. I've been thinking about this for a while, and it's been something I've wanted to talk out, get there into the space, and just talk about it. And so I guess the place we have to start is where intellectual properties and board games first met. Not historically speaking, but kind of at least in my history, my gaming history, and what I would imagine is your gaming history too. So years ago, 20, 30 years ago, 90s, maybe even in the 80s, a lot of times publishing companies, mostly the likes of Hasbro, would take an intellectual property or an IP for short, and they would pair it with a game that was complete garbage, but they knew it could sell a lot because of this intellectual property that they would attach to it. Essentially, if they put on some popular TV show or movie onto this game, it would be something that would excite people and get them to make a purchase. The problem was people played those games maybe once or twice and realized how much garbage they were. And then intellectual properties from there just got a really bad reputation, especially within the hobby board game industry. People weren't buying any of these games, at least in the hobby. There's still, I mean, if you're in Walmart or Target, you're still going to make sales, but people were much more hesitant to start buying intellectual property games. The idea that an IP was slapped on something just to make it sell was extremely prevalent. Now, in recent years, that's changed a little bit in that there's a significant amount of design work going behind the games that are being put out with intellectual properties. If you look at Fantasy Flight Games, they're producing tons of Star Wars content, tons of Marvel content. You got companies like The Op that have put out Thanos Rising. They put out the Harry Potter stuff. You've got Ravensburger, who they have like Jaws, and they've quite a few different Target releases. And then Prospero Hall, who was recently, it's a design group that was bought by Funko. They've put out things like Disney Villainous. They've put out Back to the Future. They've put out, let's see, there's a whole bunch of different things they've put out. They put out one recently that's based on a ride from Disney World. It's something about a jungle train or something, or jungle cart. I'm not exactly sure what that one is. I haven't heard good things on that one. But for the most part, these games, there's a Top Gun game. These games have been reviewed fairly well. And a lot of reviewers in this space have been talking about how great it is that we're seeing kind of a renaissance of IP games that are coming out with different intellectual properties attached to them that are actually good games. And while I'm always happy if good games are being published, I am really hesitant about the idea of attaching IPs like these to board games. And I actually think it's really problematic. I know I'm in the minority here, but there's a lot of reasons behind that. So to start out with, if you want to acquire the license to use that, it's going to cost more money to do that. You're paying for the rights to use Marvel or to or Harry Potter. The idea being, once you put that theme on it, you're going to sell more copies, and then some royalties have to go to the ones that created it or owned the rights to the creation of that intellectual property. And so I'm all good for that. I think that's fair that you'd have to pay them for that. I'm not about counterfeiting or stealing somebody's work. But when you do that, that's going to do one of two things. It's either going to make the game cost more expensive, directly hurting the consumer because now the same game would cost less with a different theme on it, or the game's going to have to be distributed in mass. It's going to have to be an extremely approachable game, which I have no problem with lighter games, games that are of lighter fare, but for me personally, I like there to be a good mix. I like to see some medium and heavyweight games as well as these lighter games. And since this IP renaissance, what we're seeing is a bunch of these games that are being published, a bunch of the games that are being talked about, a bunch of the games that people are gravitating toward. And once again, if you like these games, I'm not condemning you. I'm not pointing you out as something that's bad for the hobby or anything. But these games have to be sold at a lesser cost in greater distribution, so they have to be more accessible to everyone, which means they're going to be lighter games. And once again, I have no problem with lighter games. I just would like, I guess, distribution to be a little bit more similar, and it just seems like everything is shifting to a lighter direction as of late. And so the reason they're lighter is because when they're a lighter game, places like Target, places like Walmart are more willing to carry them because there's a broader audience and there's more people that are willing to buy that game simply based on the fact that it has an intellectual property that is popular beyond just board gamers. So you're going to get more sales. Therefore, you don't have to raise the cost of the game to make up for the intellectual property. You're just selling more copies. So essentially, you're just getting a smaller cut of the pie, but your distribution channels are so much larger that it's okay. And you can sell a game at $30-$40, and it works perfectly fine. If you build a heavier game with an IP, though, you are going to have to charge more for it. Recently, what we've seen is like The Thing. If you saw that on Kickstarter as of late, I think it's like $70 or $80, and if you look at the content that comes in that box, it doesn't look like enough stuff to justify that cost. But the reason that cost is there is because they have to pay for the intellectual property. Now, there have been plenty of games that have been released that have essentially been The Thing without the actual branding of The Thing, and they were able to sell it at a lower price point. And so I don't know, that bothers me, right? That there's room in this hobby to be creative, to make your own universe, to make something maybe influenced by an intellectual property, but maybe not be that exact property. Look at Greater Than Games with the Sentinels of the Multiverse universe. Multiverse universe, that sounds kind of funny, but they've taken that, built it from the ground up, and yeah, there's clearly some characters that are like, oh, this is Batman reworked just a little bit. Oh, this is Superman reworked just a little bit. But what they've done is they've created a whole universe that they kept expanding upon, and now it's very different, I would say, than DC or Marvel. They have plenty of different types of characters, and yes, that was clearly the influence to what got them going, but now they have this robust universe where they have a cooperative card game, they have a tactics game with miniatures, they have an RPG that you can get, so you can role play as these characters. And coming out, I think that the 20th, they're launching essentially a new take on Defenders of the Realm with the Sentinels of the Multiverse IP, something they created, something that came out of their design works. So they put in the effort to make something that was unique to the board game world. And so initially when they released Sentinels of the Multiverse, the cost was way less than if they had to try and get the rights to use Marvel, if they would be able to, or DC. There's other companies out there that probably have a vested interest, at least at that time. Now it seems like everybody can get intellectual properties, but probably had a vested interest in not allowing other companies, like a small publishing company like Greater Than Games was, to utilize those IPs. So they thought about it and they made their own, and it was very successful. And when you keep the intellectual properties in house, you don't have this initial cost raise. You don't need this massive distribution. And guess what? You can publish whatever the heck you want in that universe. You don't need someone else's permission to do it. You don't need to say, is this okay, Marvel, that I make this type of card game? Is this okay that I produce this sort of Star Wars content? Is this okay that I'm doing these things? You don't have to go reach out to another publishing company and say, hey, can I pair with you because you have the license for this intellectual property and I want to use it on this game? You just make and create a universe that works thematically with the game that you've created. And so when there's a demand for a game, you can just reprint it. You don't have to go through all these different channels. Right now, Battlestar Galactica is a really, really hot game as far as a game that's older. A lot of people talk about it. A lot of people love it. People like the expansions. People like the game as a whole. That game's not going to get reprinted. There's no way Fantasy Flight's going to pay for the rights for that, being that it was a show that hasn't been on in years. And so what are they going to do? They produce it and retheme it? That whole game was designed around that IP. And so good games, if good games are created under IPs, they never get reprinted. If they no longer have the rights to those IPs. Tom Vassell has this, it's called Vassell's Law. If a game is good enough, wait long enough and it'll be reproduced. It'll be reprinted. But he does have an exception in there. His exception is this doesn't count for IP games because it's really difficult to acquire those rights and keep those rights. And so you have a terrible time trying to reprint them if it's later on, if it's even a desirable IP, because you don't want to spend a ton of money on an IP that you can't utilize to its fullest extent, right? If it's a small print run, there's no reason to try and shell out that money. And so it's better off to use your own properties, use your own intellectual properties. And it's starting to get very interesting too if we continue to look at intellectual properties, because games like, so I was talking about Sentinels of the Multiverse. That's a very clear IP within the board gaming world. And if you look at that Kickstarter, Arcane Wonders and the Dice Tower Essential line, that's one thing. Dice Tower Essential, it's not one thing essentially, but Dice Tower Essentials is only through Arcane Wonders. They clearly wanted to bring out a new take on Defenders of the Realm, and they wanted to, they wanted a superhero IP with it. From what I've heard, Richard Launius is crazy about superheroes, so that makes sense. But now they've had to pair with Greater Than Games. Overall, though, this is good for the board game hobby because we're now seeing themes. We're creating our own IPs and we're functioning within that. And yes, publishing companies are working together, but the fact that if those companies both believe that a reprint is something that will sell, it's much easier to make a reprint happen. You're not looking to somebody that's creating films or creating other media content or cartoons or things like that for that permission. You're looking to another board game company that has just as much a vested interest in the board game being successful. I looked recently, there's news that came out that Simon is going to be publishing some comics for Asmodee through their comic line in the Twilight Imperium and the Android universe, which I think is it's pretty interesting when you look at what Asmodee and really other companies have done in the past. So in March or February 2019, Simon decided, or it's Come On Games. Come On Games decided to essentially have Asmodee take over their distribution just to make that easier on them. They didn't have to handle those channels anymore. Later down the line, Asmodee pairs with Dark Horse Comics to produce certain art books for different products that they make. And so they paired with Dark Horse as a publisher essentially. And then in October of 2019, they made a new fiction imprint called Aconite, and they secured a multi-year deal with Marvel to produce novels for Marvel. Essentially, it's a multi-year deal. They're gonna be, I think, starting fall of 2020. So they might already be in print. They might already be out, or they might be coming out. But so they've started their own publishing line. But now they're going over to Come On because they know Come On kickstarts these comics, and they're saying, hey, we distribute for you. Like, let's work together. Let's make this thing happen. And so Come On's going to be publishing comics in 2 board game universes that were IPs that were created through board games. Once again, now Come On and Asmodee have a vested interest in those being successful. Not that outside companies wouldn't have a vested interest in it, but they look at it a lot differently because they don't have the full investment. So I guess what I'm trying to say, I keep pointing back to this. If we keep IPs in-house, if board game creators are the ones that are creating the intellectual properties for the games we play, the good ones are going to be reprinted in the future. The games are going to cost less. And ultimately, we will get to tell the stories we want to hear. We don't have to submit or go to these movie creators, these other, cartoon or comic creators, and get guidance on how to build our games. We can build a universe around the mechanics we want to see. We can, when our demand says this is a great product, make more, that IP starts to grow. Look at the Arkham Horror line in Fantasy Flight. I mean, I know that's H.P. Lovecraft, and that's kind of an intellectual property, but it's open source, so it's a little bit different altogether because you don't pay any money for it. But the Arkham series is clearly something that Fantasy Flight has been developing for a long time, and look at how many people are pulled in by that universe. I mean, it's become something totally different than what's expected from just a movie genre, or a favorite book that you've read. So overall, I think we need to start creating our own IPs, support our own IPs, and hope that our own IPs continue to get created, and stop falling for these new IPs, these new games. If they're really, really good, I'm happy they're on your shelf, but unfortunately they're not going to be reprinted. At some point they're going to fall off, and they're going to be hard to get, and that's going to suck. We're going to wish that they had some different flavor to them. But maybe I'm the only one in that camp. Let me know what you think. Are IPs bad or IPs good? Do you love games with intellectual properties attached to them? If so, what are your favorite ones and why? But otherwise, just let me know your thoughts. Let me know what you're thinking. Am I totally off base? Am I too concerned about money and distribution? Am I too concerned about having our own created products in the market? I'm really curious to know what you think. Otherwise, this has been the Neoprene Playmat, and have a great day.